The air hung thick and heavy with the scent of pine and churned earth. For 3 days, the spring storm had raged across the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, stripping the canyons bare and unleashing a torrent of icy, mud-brown water into the Rio Pueblo. The river, usually a silver ribbon whispering over smooth stones, was now a violent, roaring beast, its voice a deep, guttural sound of immense power. It carried debris, foam, and the raw, wet energy of the high desert. Sunny, barely 6 years old, stood at the riverbank, a small, fragile figure against the immense landscape. Her worn cotton dress was faded from countless washings, and her black braids swung against her narrow shoulders. Her bare feet, calloused and familiar with the earth, were chilled, the cold seeping through the silty mud. Her morning chore was simple: collect the driftwood the storm had gifted, firewood to keep the small cabin stove warm until midday. But the river was giving more than wood. Her gaze, wide and focused as a hawk's, first registered a shifting, pale shape, a form too large for a branch, too soft for a rock. She squinted, her small brow furrowed in concentration. For a frightening moment, her mind supplied the image of a dead deer, a common tragedy after such floods. But then, as the current momentarily snagged the mass against a partially submerged boulder, she saw it. A hand. Not the hoof of an animal, but a pale, slender hand, its fingers tangled in strands of impossibly white gold hair. The sight extinguished the last vestiges of her morning calm. A sharp, metallic fear seized her chest, making her breath hitch. She had been taught by her father, Loren, to respect the river, to listen to it, never to challenge it. The river was life, but today it was a hungry, angry spirit. Without hesitation, she turned from the frightening sight and screamed a high, desperate cry in her native Apache that cut through the roar of the water like a physical knife. Loren heard the fear in that sound. Across the field, where he was inspecting his small corral, he froze. He didn't need to hear the words. The tone spoke of genuine terror, not a child's tantrum. He moved instantly, his tall, lean frame accelerating with the fluid economy of a predator. He was a man whose movements were dictated by necessity and honed by the wilderness. His skin, aged by sun and the relentless New Mexico air, was the color of dark, polished mahogany, and his long hair, tied back with a simple strip of buckskin, trailed slightly behind him. He reached the bank. His steadying hand immediately finding Sunny's shoulder, she pointed, trembling. His eyes, dark and deep-set, scanned the current until they located the obstruction. There, pinned between 2 jagged rocks, was the body of a woman. Her dress was ripped, her face turned toward the sky, utterly lifeless. He took it all in at once, the unnatural pallor, the blue of her lips, the almost unbearable fragility of her form. She is gone, his immediate rational mind concluded. The river has claimed her, but Loren was a healer, trained to look past the surface. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the icy splash, and leaned closer. The material of her dress, a once fine fabric now sodden and tattered, seemed to lift and fall in a faint, involuntary shudder. His practiced eye caught the slight, unmistakable trembling of her ribcage beneath the wet cloth. "She is breathing," he confirmed, the words a low rumble in the noise. "She is barely breathing." He removed his worn, sturdy boots and, ignoring the shock of the frigid water that bit into his legs, waded in. The mud swallowed his feet up to his ankles, resisting his progress. The current was powerful, shoving against him, demanding the woman back. Loren fought it with a deep-rooted strength, his years of navigating this terrain giving him an edge. He reached the woman, his large hands carefully untangling her hair from the rock. When he finally lifted her, she was shockingly light, a weight of air and sorrow as he later thought. He carried her to the shore, the child watching with terrified fascination. He laid her gently on the grass. Sunny, her initial fear giving way to nervous curiosity, knelt beside him. "Is she a ghost, Papa?" she whispered in Apache. Loren began his work, his hands moving with an instinctive, quiet expertise honed by years of village emergencies. He gently turned her to her side, pressing on her back to expel the river water. Then, moving with meticulous care, he crushed the aromatic leaves of wild sage and mountain mint he kept stored in a small pouch on his belt. The sharp, clean scent cut through the odor of wet river silt. He placed the paste beneath her nostrils. The effect was slow but decisive. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing a startling, complex blue, the color of a storm clearing over the canyon lands. She stared up at the vast, unfamiliar sky, then at the man whose face was all shadows and angles, and the small, dark-eyed child who clung to his shirt. Where am I?" she managed, her voice a dry, rasping sound. "You are safe now," Loren replied, his voice low and steady, a calm point in the raging morning. "By the Rio Pueblo. You must not move," she struggled, a flicker of panic in her eyes, her hand flying to her ribs. "I need to leave." "My family." Loren's touch on her shoulder was firm but gentle, demanding obedience. "Easy," he said. "The river tried to take you. Let the land give you back first. There is no going anywhere today. You need fire, food, and rest." His eyes, steady and clear, held hers, offering no pity, only an immutable truth. "The river takes those who hurry." He lifted her again. She offered a weak protest, but her strength was utterly spent. He carried her across the damp meadow toward his dwelling, a small, sturdy cabin of stacked pine logs and sun-baked adobe, its chimney already sending a thin curl of blue smoke into the air. Inside, the cabin was a sanctuary of warmth. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, releasing their gentle, earthy perfumes. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth. Loren laid her on the cot and tucked the heavy buffalo hide blanket around her. He looked at the scratches on her arms, the fading bruise on her temple, but saw the deeper wound, profound exhaustion laced with a lingering dread. "What is your name?" he asked, tending the fire, not looking at her. "Claire," she whispered, the name sounding foreign even to her own ears. "Rest, Claire," he said. "You are safe here." Claire looked around at the humble, warm room, at the gentle face of the child, and at the quiet strength of the man. She gave that small, hollow laugh. "Safe," she repeated. "I don't know what that word means anymore." Loren, however, simply went to his stores. He mixed crushed roots into warm water until it glowed pale gold, a soothing elixir. He held it out to her. "Drink this," he commanded. She hesitated, suspicion clouding her eyes. "You expect me to drink something from a stranger?" He turned his gaze fully upon her, his calm demeanor unyielding. "You're already in my home drinking my fire," he stated. "You can choose to live or not. The land has already chosen for you." For a long, charged moment, their eyes locked. Then, defeated by cold fear and a strange sense of surrender, Claire took the bowl. She sipped and felt the warmth spread through her chest, the first genuine warmth she had felt in months. Sunny crouched nearby, her braids falling forward, watching with the endless curiosity of a child. "Are you from the big towns?" she asked, her voice soft. "With the shining horses and the dresses that drag in the dust?" Claire managed a faint, tired smile. "Something like that." Loren rose and walked to the doorway, his silhouette framed by the morning light. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean and the river glinting. He spoke, his back to her. "If the river brought you here, there is a reason. The wind carries only what the earth wants back." Claire lay there, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant, constant rush of the river that had tried to claim her. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt a warmth that wasn't born of fever or fear. And somewhere outside the cabin, she heard Sonny's soft, bell-like laughter carried on the wind, a small, bright sound that, unbeknownst to Claire, was the sound calling her back to life. The fever she carried from the river was not merely a physical ailment. It was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that acted as a physical barrier against her pride. It was the only reason Claire stayed. She had told herself she would be gone the moment her strength returned, but the fever left her slow, her mind light-headed. And the thought of facing the path down the canyon, the path back to an unknown, feared future, was simply too heavy to bear. The weakness in her muscles was mirrored by a psychic numbness, a lingering effect of the cold indifference that had nearly claimed her. The first few days were a blur of drifting between sleep and a confused state of near waking. The cabin was tiny, built for necessity, yet it possessed a profound, earthy comfort. Claire lay on the cot, enveloped by the thick, lanolin scent of the buffalo hide blanket. Every sound outside the thin pine walls was magnified, the soft rustle of firewood being stacked, the low, melodic humming of Loren as he worked his mortar and pestle, and most powerfully the steady, light footfalls of Sonny. The sound had a rhythm, a pulse that seemed to beat in time with the very earth, utterly foreign to the anxious, hurried tempo of the town life Claire had known. It was the sound of a life that was uncomplicated by ambition, only by survival. When she was finally strong enough to sit up without the room spinning, Loren moved her. He brought her a small carved wooden stool onto the porch. From this vantage point, the sheer, staggering scale of the New Mexico wildlands revealed itself. The Rio Pueblo curled silver through the valley floor, no longer a raging monster, but a ribbon of gentle, moving light. She could smell the pungent, sharp scent of the pine forest, mixing with the dryness of the dust and the sweet, almost intoxicating aroma of wild tobacco growing near the cabin. The sun was brilliant, pouring gold onto the red earth. But here, beneath the porch overhang, it was warm and welcoming, not cruel, Claire realized, with a profound jolt that shook her to her core, that she was not afraid of the silence. In her former life, silence was the enemy. It was the moment when her husband's voice went cold, when the whispers of failure filled the vast, echoing rooms of her house. Here the silence was full. It contained the wind sighing through the canyons, the distant call of a hawk circling the cliffs, the tiny, incessant drone of insects in the tall grass. It felt like solitude, not abandonment. Sonny quickly became the bridge between Claire and this foreign life. The little girl, endlessly curious and completely devoid of the social judgments Claire was used to, would sit near her, plaiting long strands of wild grass into tiny, complex ropes. "You came from where the trees are tall," Sonny would ask, her large eyes fixed on Claire. "Taller than Father's house?" "Yes," Claire would manage. "Did you have shiny shoes?" "Yes, shiny shoes." The questions were simple yet piercing. Sonny was asking about surfaces, but Claire knew the questions were really about the emptiness beneath those surfaces. When Sonny asked why Claire's eyes sometimes looked sad, even when she smiled, Claire's throat would tighten. She would gently deflect, speaking only of the trees and the rain that didn't taste of dust. She spoke of the fact of her departure, never the cause, the sterile house filled with her husband's cold resentment, the years of whispered prayers and crushing disappointment, and the desperate morning she walked away, hoping the storm would achieve the finality her own heart lacked the courage for. Loren observed the dynamic between the two, though he rarely participated. He was a man defined by a calm patience, a deep well of endurance Claire had never encountered. In the mornings he disappeared into the hills, his leather pouch swinging easily at his side, returning at dusk with medicinal plants and roots. His presence was consistent, reliable, like the setting sun. He never lingered near her, never demanded conversation or gratitude, yet Claire began to notice the small, quiet ways he cared. It was in the fresh wooden bowl of cool well water left by her cot each dawn. It was in the mended latch on the cabin window, fixed after a sudden gust threatened to rattle it open. It was in the precise placement of her stool on the porch, always facing the gentlest angle of the sun. He didn't offer help. He simply made her existence easier. The profound lack of ownership or expectation was the most healing balm. Claire had spent her entire adult life defined by what she lacked: a child, a compliant spirit, a respectable grief. Here she was simply a wounded person whom the earth had decided to keep. She began to spend time watching Loren work. He would sit at his workbench, the air thick with the smell of crushed herbs, his scarred hands moving with meticulous reverence. He treated every root and leaf with the focus of a jeweler. There was a stillness about him that Claire realized was not emptiness, but post-noise quiet, the absolute calm that comes only after surviving overwhelming violence and sorrow. His movements were deliberate, weighted with the knowledge that life was precious and required respect in every action. One afternoon, spurred by a need to understand the source of this profound quiet, she broke the comfortable silence. "How long have you lived here, Loren?" He didn't look up, his fingers carefully separating the fibers of a root. "Since before the soldiers came," he said, his voice flat, historical. "Before they told us where we could and could not belong." She hesitated. Her conscience pricked. "You lost someone." He paused then, his hands resting on his work. "My wife. The fever took her the winter they burned our village. They destroyed the structures, but the sickness took the life." He gave a slight, dismissive shrug, a gesture that was more acceptance than sorrow. "The wind carries her name. Some nights I still hear it." That night, Claire lay awake, listening to the distant, lonely wail of the coyotes across the valley. It was a sound full of long, honest grief. She thought about Loren's words, the wind carrying names, and she wondered if her own name, Claire Donovan, was still being carried anywhere at all, or if it had simply dissolved into the river's current. The next morning, she offered her small labor. "I can help Sunny gather berries," she offered. Sunny clapped her hands with delight. "She will make you shitza," she announced. Shitza, Loren had explained, meant kind lady or aunt. They walked along the riverbank, the sound of Sunny skipping and singing in a mix of Apache and broken English filling the air. Claire found herself laughing, a genuine free sound she hadn't realized her chest was capable of producing. It felt like a muscle long dormant suddenly awakening. When they returned, they found Loren bent over a sick pony that a neighboring herder had brought. The animal's leg was mangled from a barbed wire fence. Loren spoke softly to the pony, a low, constant murmur, applying a poultice that smelled of pine resin and smoke. The herder, a gruff, sunburnt white man, stood back, his uncertainty radiating outward. "You trust him?" Claire asked the man. He spat in the dirt, a noise of resignation. "He's the only one who knows what he's doing out here. Doctors charge too much and don't know the wild." Later, Claire watched Loren from the doorway. "You help them all?" she asked. "I try," Loren said, cleaning the tools. "White Apache doesn't matter. Pain doesn't wear colors." His simple statement stayed with her, resonating with a power that dismantled years of learned prejudice. She thought of her world, a place where everything, worth, blood, reputation, a woman's fertility, was rigidly measured and judged. Compared to the vast, open philosophy of the man standing before her, her former life was revealed as tragically small and suffocatingly closed. She realized for the first time that she wasn't just recovering from an illness. She was receiving an education. That evening they shared a simple supper, corn stew and hard bread. The quiet comfort was palpable. As Sunny talked about a hawk she'd seen, Loren listened, nodding. Claire watched the firelight play over his face, tracing the lines etched not by age, but by relentless sun and profound sorrow. After Sunny went to bed, Loren poured water into a tin cup for Claire. "You should rest, too." "I can't," she admitted, the old fear surfacing. "When I close my eyes, I see the river." He sat across from her, his posture relaxed yet alert. "The river doesn't want you now. It gave you back." Claire stared into the flames. "Maybe it should have kept me." Loren was silent for a long moment, the air thick with the unspoken weight of her despair. Then he spoke softly, the words coming from a deep, assured place. "Among my people, when someone loses their way, we say they've forgotten how to breathe. The river didn't bring you here to die, Claire. It brought you here to learn again." She wanted to argue, to scoff at the spiritual simplicity of his claim. But his voice carried no pity, only an immutable certainty. And in that quiet, warm room, with the scent of sage heavy and the wind pressing softly against the door, something inside her finally surrendered. The tightly bound knot of her shame and sorrow loosened. The next morning, she stepped outside alone, before dawn. The valley was draped in a silver mist, and the river whispered low in its bed. She filled her lungs with the sharp, cold air, pulling it deep into her chest. And for the first time in months, she felt that breath meant something more than mere physical survival. It meant choice. It meant life. The process of learning to breathe again had truly begun. The valley, which had roared with the chaotic energy of the storm, now settled into the quiet hum of late spring. Weeks bled into one another with the same slow, deliberate pace. For Claire, the need to flee, a reflex honed by years of failure and judgment, began to atrophy. She had intended to leave the moment her fever broke, yet the path down the canyon, The imaginary route back to civilization remained blurred in her mind, and her body refused to follow the thought. She was caught in a gravitational pull exerted not by walls or demands, but by the relentless, profound simplicity of the life Loren lived. She still drifted between long, restorative sleeps and periods of hazy waking, but now her senses were tuned to the cadence of the cabin. She no longer merely heard the sounds. She absorbed them, the rhythmic grind of the mortar and pestle, a sound like a heartbeat made of stone and wood, the gentle shh of the wind moving over the sagebrush, a constant low murmur that seemed to carry ancient secrets, and the soft, perpetual presence of Sunny, whose shadow was never far from the porch. The silence was not empty. It was dense, saturated with the quiet industry of a life completely attuned to its own necessities. When the sun was at its brightest, Claire began to emerge from the protective cocoon of the cot. She would sit on the porch, her gaze fixed on the river, no longer as a symbol of attempted suicide, but as a living vein in the earth. The air, crisp and clean, mingled the sharp scent of pine with the complex sweetness of wild tobacco. The absence of fear in this silence was her deepest healing. Sunny, with the relentless, pure curiosity of a 6-year-old, remained her tireless inquisitor. The little girl acted as the valley's intuitive translator. She didn't ask why Claire was sad, but how the sadness felt, offering up her own small observations as anchors. "Father says the stars are holes where the rain used to be," she might say. "Does your sadness have holes too, Shitza?" Claire would deflect, offering carefully curated facts about her former life, the height of city buildings, the trailing skirts of society dresses, but she never spoke of the emptiness she had mistaken for order. She never spoke of the crushing knowledge that she could not bear the son her husband demanded, a failure that had hollowed out her marriage and her soul. Loren, meanwhile, maintained his distance, treating her with a reserved deference that stripped their interaction of any expectation. He moved with the unhurried patience of a man who listens to the slow pulse of the land. His movements were never wasted. His attention was absolute, whether he was grinding a root or mending a bridle. Claire realized there was a stillness to him, a core of unshakable calm that could only have been forged by surviving a cacophony of noise. His hands, scarred and roughened by work, moved with a delicate precision when handling herbs, as if every leaf and root deserved its own solemn respect. One late afternoon, as the shadows lengthened and the valley turned a deep ochre, Claire found herself watching him from the porch, observing the way the sun caught the lines at the corners of his eyes, lines etched not just by sun, but by deep sorrow. "How long have you carried that silence?" she asked, the question surprising even herself. Loren paused, his fingers resting on the cedar wood he was carving. "Since the snows that followed the soldiers," he said, his voice low, historical. "Since they came and told us the mountains belonged to them, and not to the spirits." Claire swallowed, a sense of shared human tragedy settling over the peaceful scene. "You lost your wife," Loren told me. "She was called Ayana," he murmured, speaking the name carefully, as if placing a fragile object down. "Fever took her, not the bullets. The cold, damp winter when they forced us from the valley and burned our homes. The fever finds those who are already broken by the earth." He shrugged, a gesture of resignation that held no self-pity, only acceptance of an immutable, universal law. "The wind carries her name," he repeated, the words a ritual. "Some nights when the wind comes through the pines just so, I hear it. It is a reminder that what is taken can still exist." That night, Claire could not sleep. The coyotes howled, a long, lonely, honest grief that mirrored the sound she felt inside her chest. She thought about Ayana, a ghost carried on the breath of the wilderness. She wondered if, among the whispers of the wind, there was any remnant of Claire Donovan, or if her name had truly been swept away into the anonymous current of the river. The thought was terrifying, yet also strangely liberating. The next morning, driven by a deep need to ground herself in tangible reality, Claire rose early and offered her help to Loren. She didn't offer a grand gesture, just small, practical aid. She learned to sort the dried herbs, identifying which plant soothed a burn and which was meant to draw out fever. Loren never ordered her, never profusely thanked her. He simply included her, as if her hands had always been part of the valley's required work. This inclusion, this quiet assumption of her worth and contribution, was the most profound kindness she had ever received. One afternoon, she burned her hand on the iron kettle while drawing water. She instinctively cried out, a sound of acute, unexpected pain. Loren was instantly beside her. He took her hand, his large, rough fingers surprisingly delicate. He didn't ask how she'd been so careless, or why she hadn't been paying attention, the automatic rebukes of her former life. He simply blew across the blistered skin, a soft, warm breath that somehow mitigated the sharp sting, then smeared a cool, green paste over the mark. "It is crushed alder bark and willow leaf," he explained, his eyes focused on her injury. "It will stop the fire and draw the healing." Claire looked at her hand, now covered in the cool, earthy poultice. "How do you know all this?" she whispered. He looked at her hand, not her eyes. "The earth teaches, if we listen long enough." His words confirmed her growing realization. His wisdom was not scholarly, but organic, earned through quiet observation and deep respect. That evening, the three of them sat by the hearth. Sunny, pleased with her day's efforts, declared Claire almost Apache after successfully braiding a small piece of Claire's now dry, thick hair. Claire laughed softly, a real sound. Loren smiled faintly. "No," he corrected gently. "The Apache are only almost human. The rest of the world forgets to be." His words struck her with the force of revelation. The world she came from, the world of finance, property, names, and rigid social codes, was a place where everything was measured and labeled, a small, suffocating box. The world she was in now was vast, untamed, and yet utterly simple. A place where the worth of a life was determined by the ability to breathe and to help others breathe. The next day, as they worked outside, a neighboring herder brought in a pony with a severely gashed leg, torn by a stretch of newly strung barbed wire, a stark reminder of the encroaching external world. Loren bent over the animal, murmuring to it softly, rubbing the wound with his smoke and resin paste. The herder, a man whose clothes and face spoke of distrust, stood back, skeptical. "You trust him?" Claire asked the herder. The man spat, resigned. "He's the only one who knows what he's doing out here. The white doctor just cuts." Later, after the herder left, leading the limping but calmer pony, Claire lingered near the doorway. "You help them all," she observed. "I try," Loren said, cleaning the dirt from his hands. "White, Apache, doesn't matter. Pain doesn't wear colors." That night, she couldn't shake the image of Loren's hands working on the pony, the same hands that had lifted her from the river. She thought of his words. She realized that Loren saw her not as a failed wife or a society girl, but as a simple equation of pain and healing. He didn't care about the color of her skin or the size of her dowry. She was a living thing that required mending. This absolute lack of judgment was, ironically, what finally allowed her own judgment against herself to crumble. Supper was corn stew, thick and filling, shared in the soft light of the hearth. Sunny chatted happily about catching grasshoppers, and Loren listened, his quiet presence anchoring the room. After Sunny was asleep, Loren handed Claire a cup of water. "You should rest," he said. "I can't," she confessed, the fear of the dark and the memory of the river still present. "When I close my eyes, I see the current." He sat across from her, the firelight catching the darkness of his face. "The river doesn't want you now. It gave you back." "Maybe it should have kept me," Claire whispered, the sentence echoing the despair of months past. Loren was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the deep conviction of his people. "Among my people, when someone loses their way, we say they've forgotten how to breathe. The river didn't bring you here to die, Claire. It brought you here to learn again." She wanted to argue, to invoke the skepticism of science and the cynicism of her society. But his voice held only certainty, a belief system so rooted in the land that it felt impossible to contest. In that small, warm room with the wind pressing against the door and the heavy, sweet scent of sage in the air, the final, rigid walls of her self-pity came down. The next morning, she stepped outside before anyone woke. The valley was draped in silver mist, the river murmuring low. She stood there, filling her lungs with the sharp, cold air, pulling it deep into her chest. And for the first time in all her years, she felt that her breath was not merely the involuntary action of survival, but a conscious choice, a choice for life. She had begun to learn the rhythm of breathing again. The delicate peace that had settled upon Loren's secluded valley was too profound, too fragile, to last indefinitely on the raw edge of the New Mexico territory. Claire had found a core of stillness, but the world she had fled, the world of possessiveness, shame, and rigid social structure had a long reach. The tension began not with a sound, but with a palpable shift in the air, a prickling restlessness that disturbed the rhythm of the valley. Claire, now keenly attuned to the land's silent communication, felt it in the way the horses in the small corral snorted more nervously, and in the way the wind seemed to hold its breath before sighing. She found herself glancing toward the ridge more often, the simple joy of working the garden undercut by a visceral sense of dread. The silence of the canyon was still full, but now it felt like a drawn bow, waiting for release. Loren, whose warrior instincts were simply dormant, not extinguished, responded to the subtle atmospheric change with quiet preparation. He spent the better part of 2 mornings honing his long hunting knife to a terrifying reflective sheen. He inspected his bow, a piece of ancient trusted wood that had seen him through skirmishes and hunts alike, checking the tautness of the sinew string and meticulously smoothing the tips of his arrows. He spoke little, but his movements were imbued with a focused gravity. He was preparing not for a hunt, but for a confrontation he instinctively knew was imminent. One hazy afternoon, as the sun climbed toward its zenith, pouring an oppressive heat into the valley, it happened. Claire and Sonny were on the porch sorting bundles of sage and juniper, the dry, therapeutic scent filling the warm air. Claire had just started to hum a soft, wordless tune, a habit she hadn't realized she'd picked up, when Sonny's hand froze mid-air, clutching a piece of grass rope. The child's eyes, wide and focused, were fixed on the distant line of the ridge where the red earth met the pale sky. 3 figures on horseback appeared. They were stark silhouettes against the horizon, instantly recognizable by their demeanor. They rode with the heavy, road-worn posture of men who carried rifles and bad intentions. They were white men, dressed in dust-caked broadcloth and low-slung hats, their horses slow and tired. Their faces, even from a distance, seemed to carry the hardness of too much road and too little kindness. Claire felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin cold and tight. The years of effort, the long, patient work of healing crumbled in a horrifying instant. Her entire body locked, immobilized by the return of her old life specter. The lead rider, a stocky man with a grim, downturned mouth, reined in his horse 30 feet from the cabin. He squinted, took in the Apache cabin, the bundles of herbs, the small girl, and finally, Claire. He pulled off his dusty hat, revealing a pale forehead line beneath the grime. It was Matthew Greer, her former husband's foreman, his gaze a mixture of contempt and morbid curiosity. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, the words thick with surprise. "That's her!" He dismounted, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the gravel path. The sound was an invasion, shattering the valley's gentle rhythm. "Miss Claire Donovan," he said, performing a mocking, exaggerated bow, his tone laced with poisonous sarcasm. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again. Folks back in Kansas said you'd finally done the decent thing and drowned yourself." He looked around the rough cabin and sneered. "Seems you've been busy instead. Living with one of them redskins, huh? Guess I can tell your fine husband he was right to let you go." Claire found her voice, a dry, brittle sound she barely recognized. "Leave!" she commanded, her hands trembling as they clenched the edge of her shawl. Greer took a step closer, his eyes raking over her now sunken cheeks and her rougher, simpler dress. "Or what, miss? He your new man now? You playing house with savages? Your husband, Mr. Donovan, he'd pay good money to fetch you back, to finish what you started, if you catch my meaning." He paused, his smirk malicious. "You've fallen low, Claire, lower than the mud that carried you here. Claire straightened, pulling strength from the memory of Loren's words. Pain doesn't wear colors. You will leave this place now, Matthew. This is not your land, and I am not your concern. Before Greer could respond, a sudden imposing shadow fell over the path. Loren stood in the doorway of the cabin, silent as stone. He had been checking his stores. His bow was not in his hands, but his presence alone was a challenge. Take your men and go, Loren said. His voice level, carrying no heat, which made it all the more chilling. Greer turned slowly, a smirk hardening into contempt. Well, look what we got here. The Red Doctor himself. Heard about you, half-breed medicine man. They say you patch up folks just so they can die slower. Loren didn't move an inch. You are trespassing, and you are unwelcome. Just visiting an old friend, Greer drawled, spitting a wad of tobacco juice into the dirt near Loren's feet. Didn't know she'd fallen this low. Shame on her family. Claire took a shaking step forward, instinctively trying to place herself between the men. He is my protector. You will leave. Loren's eyes, dark and flat like obsidian, narrowed slightly. The temperature of the air seemed to drop around him. She doesn't belong to any man, he stated, the words cutting through the tension. The truth of that statement, the absolute defiance of the societal laws that had governed Claire's entire life, flared between them. It made Greer's smile falter, but the pride and liquor in his system burned hotter than sense. You got nerve, Injun. The rifle came up fast, a flash of metal, a blur against the sun. Loren moved faster. He swung the heavy wooden pestle, the tool of his healing work, in his hand, striking Greer's forearm with a sickening, audible crack. The shot went wild, its explosion echoing deafeningly into the canyon. The horses reared in panic. The other two men immediately drew their weapons, shouting confused orders. Stay down! Loren barked, shoving Claire and Sonny violently behind the thick adobe wall of the porch. Bullets slammed into the pine logs, splintering the wood, the air instantly acrid with gunpowder. Sonny screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure terror. Loren dropped the pestle, snatching up his bow from where he kept it hidden just inside the doorframe. With the fluid, practiced motion of a man born to the weapon, he notched an arrow and released it. The arrow flew true, thudding deep into one man's thigh. The rider howled, dropping his gun, stumbling back into the bushes. The third man fired wildly. The bullet hissed past Loren, grazing his shoulder. He gasped, a dark stain blossoming instantly against the beige of his shirt. Father, Sonny screamed again, desperately. Inside! Take her inside, Claire! Claire reacted instinctively, adrenaline overriding the shock. She grabbed Sonny, dragging the screaming girl into the dim sanctuary of the cabin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of renewed terror. She turned just in time to see Greer mounting his horse, clutching his shattered forearm. He glared at Loren, hatred contorting his features. "This ain't over!" he spat, his voice promising retribution. "You'll pay for this, both of you." Then, with a furious urgency, he and his remaining henchmen spurred their horses up the ridge, leaving a chaotic swirl of dust and gunsmoke in their wake. When the last frantic echo of the hooves faded, Claire scrambled out, running to Loren. He was slumped on the porch steps, his shirt already soaked dark with blood, his face pale but utterly composed. "You're hurt," she whispered. Kneeling beside him, her hands hovering, useless. "It's nothing," he insisted, though his breath was ragged. "It's not nothing," she snapped, the first surge of genuine, protective anger she had felt in years. "You're bleeding." Sonny crawled out of the doorway, clinging to her father's thigh, weeping uncontrollably. Loren murmured something low and soothing in Apache, rubbing the top of her head. He turned to Claire, his voice surprisingly calm. "Get the blue jar from the shelf, the one with the pine scent. And water." She fetched the supplies, her movements frantic yet precise. The smell of crushed pine needles and alcohol stung her nose. Loren began to clean the wound with practiced ease. But when he reached to tear a strip of cloth for a bandage, his fingers began to tremble. Claire gently took the cloth from him. "Let me," she commanded. He hesitated, then slowly nodded, trusting her. She cleaned the wound, then tightly wrapped the bandage, her palm pressing firmly against his broad shoulder to staunch the flow. The feel of his skin, warm, alive, and suddenly fragile, sent a tremor through her. They'll come back, she whispered, the fear returning, cold and metallic. Yes, Loren said, leaning his head back against the log wall. But not tonight. They are cowards. The dark scares men like that. She met his eyes, which were filled with a deep, resolute clarity. What will you do? What I've always done, he said. Protect what the earth gives me. And in that moment, something shifted violently within Claire. No one, not her family, not her husband, had ever said that about her. No one had ever claimed her as something worth the risk of death. She realized with a clarity that pierced the last veil of her sorrow that she was no longer merely surviving. She was protected. For the next few days, the valley held its breath. Loren's wound healed slowly. Claire stayed close, grinding herbs and tending the fire, her movements now imbued with purpose. At night, when the wind rattled the windows, Sonny crept into Claire's bed, whispering that she dreamed of gunshots. Claire held her, humming the low, wordless lullabies she had learned from the wind and from... The days following the confrontation with Greer were steeped in an atmosphere of volatile stillness. The violence had done more than splinter the porch logs. It had irrevocably shattered the fragile, tentative peace Claire had cultivated. Yet paradoxically, it had forged a steel link between her and Loren. The danger had crystallized their bond, transforming their quiet companionship into a necessary, shared vigilance. Loren's graze, a deep, painful trough across his shoulder, was a constant, throbbing reminder of the price of his defense. He dismissed it as nothing, but the effort of grinding herbs or lifting wood pulled at the wound, making his face tighten with a flicker of pain he couldn't quite mask. Claire, feeling a surge of responsibility, took charge of his care. She meticulously cleaned the wound with the pine-scented alcohol from the blue jar, the sharp medicinal odor filling the cabin. Her hands, once prone to trembling from anxiety, were now steady, focused by necessity. She bandaged him daily, her fingers learning the contour of his musculature, the warmth of his skin, a profound, quiet intimacy born of trauma. During these close moments, Loren's usual reserve cracked slightly. He would lean into her ministrations, his breath catching when she pressed too firmly. The silence between them was no longer one of patient observation, but one of deep, concentrated trust. The cabin itself became a sanctuary under siege. Outside, the land waited, the wind sighing through the canyons carrying the distant memory of gunfire. Inside, the three of them moved in a tight, protective orbit. Claire's role expanded beyond healer. She became the tireless guardian of the home. She tended the fire, ground the herbs, and cooked the simple meals, her movements flowing with an efficiency she never knew she possessed. Loren watched her, his quiet nod of approval now a frequent acknowledgement of her competence. At night, the shadows were thick with fear. Sonny, haunted by the images of the armed men and the loud, echoing violence, began to wake with piercing nightmares. She would creep into Claire's cot, her small body shaking, whispering in terror about the loud men and the glint of metal. Claire held the child tightly, rocking her, and humming the low, wordless tunes she'd heard Loren sing. Tunes that sounded like the earth breathing. She became the physical buffer against the encroaching darkness. One quiet evening, as the sky turned the deep, rich copper of dusk, Loren sat outside sharpening his long hunting knife. Claire brought him a tin cup of water and sat beside him. The air was cool, the wind a soft ruffle in the tall grass. They could come back, she stated, the worry a dull ache in her voice. Yes, Loren replied, testing the knife's edge with his thumb. But not easily. They found shame here. Cowards hate to return to the place of their defeat. Claire looked at his profile, etched against the fading light, the lines of sorrow, the new lines of strain. Why did you risk your life for me? You didn't even know me, she asked, the question hanging between them, raw and essential. Loren paused, the movement of the knife halting. He looked out at the horizon for a long time, as if composing his answer from the landscape itself. When I saw the river give you back, he began slowly, his voice a low rumble. I thought of Ayana, my wife. The fever took her and I could not stop it. That failure, that inability to guard the life that belonged to me. It hollowed me out. He turned his deep eyes to meet hers, and Claire felt the full, unfiltered weight of his soul. When the land gives you a second chance to save someone, Claire, to stand against what tries to take life, you don't stop and ask who they are, or what their name is, or what past they carry. You simply accept the gift. Claire blinked away tears that had formed instantly, tears of impossible gratitude. You could have let me go. You should have. He shook his head, focusing again on the blade. No, you belong to the living now. You just needed someone to remind you that your life was still yours. His voice softened, becoming almost a whisper. You reminded me that the effort of fighting for life is the truest prayer. They sat in silence, the emotional depth of their shared history now surpassing the history of their respective pasts. The wind moved through the grass like a collective breath. The next afternoon, the weather turned. A sudden violent squall swept down from the mountains. It wasn't the relentless rain of the first storm, but a sharp howling blast of wind and icy sheets of water. Loren rushed to the corral, knowing the raw, primal fear the elements instilled in the animals. You should come inside, Claire shouted, holding the door against the wind's sudden fury. The animals need calm more than walls. He shouted back. They feel fear. As a gate latch blew open with a crack, Loren raced to secure it. Inside the enclosure, the mare, a beautiful, skittish beast, reared, eyes wide with panic, striking out blindly against the fence. The gate was wide open, and the mare was moments from bolting into the chaotic, wind-swept canyon. Without a second thought, Claire ran forward. Adrenaline surged, focusing her mind. She grabbed the loose rope hanging from the mare's halter, her voice suddenly finding a steady, calm resonance. She spoke to the horse instinctively, not in English or Apache, but in a low, soothing rhythm of sound. The mare, nostrils flaring, ears pinned back, stilled. The sound of Claire's voice, steady and unpanicked against the howling wind, was an anchor. Loren caught her eye across the rain-swept yard. He was soaked through, breathless, but a genuine, powerful smile broke across his face, a rare, unguarded thing that reached his dark eyes. Good, he said simply, his voice a rush of pride and relief. You speak the same language as the wind. They were both drenched, hair plastered to their faces, streaked with mud, but a wave of shared, exhilarated laughter washed over them. Claire couldn't remember the last time she had laughed so freely, without the weight of scrutiny or sorrow. When they stepped into the warm cabin, shaking off the water, Sunny ran to them with a towel, scolding them like a tiny self-appointed mother hen. Loren knelt, kissed the top of her head, and handed Claire a towel. Thank you, Claire said softly, looking at him, her heart thrumming. He smiled again, the rare, quiet smile. You're welcome, Shitza, the Apache word, kind lady, spoken with that particular warmth, settled deep in her chest. That night, after Sunny had gone to bed, the rain continued, whispering softly on the roof, a sound like gentle breath. Claire sat by the fire, her mind calm, while Loren mended a broken strap near the hearth. She's lucky to have you, Claire said, watching him. Loren didn't look up. No, I am the lucky one. She is what kept me from turning to stone, Claire smiled faintly. And me? Loren set down his work. He looked at her then, his gaze heavy with intent, recognition, and something deeper than simple attraction. You remind me that stone can bloom again. The air thickened, filled with unspoken things. There was no need for grand pronouncements. Their eyes met across the small space, a quiet recognition of two souls who had walked through the fire of loss and somehow found the same small, persistent light waiting. He reached across the space between them, his hand, rough and warm, gently brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. His touch lingered, a fraction of a second longer than necessary. I didn't mean to, Claire began, but the words failed. She was done with apologies, done with fear. Instead, she leaned forward, closing the distance herself. The kiss was gentle, almost questioning, an inquiry rather than a claim. It was the soft meeting of two people who had spent too long alone. He drew back slightly, searching her face, the firelight casting their features in gold and shadow. Are you sure? He asked, his voice low and serious. She nodded once, firm and final. "I'm done being afraid of what's kind." He touched his forehead to hers, a gesture of profound respect and commitment. "Then let the wind be our witness." Outside, the storm broke again, thunder rolling across the canyon like the deep, resonant drum of distant hooves. Inside, the world narrowed to the sound of their breath, the warmth of the fire, and the steady rain against the roof, a rhythm older than any language they had ever known. The silence between them had finally become the sound of home. The months following the showdown with Greer and the silent, profound commitment exchanged under the shelter of the storm settled into a period of deep, restorative peace. The threat hadn't vanished. It simply retreated, pushed back by the sheer resilient force of life within the valley. The external violence had forced Loren and Claire to recognize the truth of their mutual need, and in that recognition, a new, vital energy began to flow. Claire's days were now defined by a sense of purpose she had never known, replacing the frantic, anxiety-driven attempts at control that characterized her former life. She found a quiet satisfaction in the routine. The smell of wood smoke in the pre-dawn cold, the rhythmic scrape of the hoe in the garden, and the precise, careful work of separating roots and leaves for Loren's medicine bags. Her hands, once soft and decorative, were now calloused and capable. They were the hands of a woman who belonged to the earth, not to a drawing room. Yet a change, subtle but insistent, began to manifest within her. It was a warmth, a deep, persistent sense of fullness beneath her ribs that was distinct from the heat of the fire or the embrace of the blanket. Her body, having finally purged the poisons of shame and fear, seemed to be vibrating at a new, slower frequency. She experienced sudden, vivid aversions to the smell of certain herbs and a dizzying lethargy that the most profound sleep could not erase. She found herself pausing over the small cedar cradle Loren had built soon after she arrived, a piece of quiet foresight he hadn't fully explained. It was sturdy and simple, the wood smoothed to a warm, inviting patina. Her hand would rest on her belly, a gesture of vague uncertainty. She had been late before, during the years of crushing hope and whispered prayers in Kansas, but those times had always been accompanied by tension, a frantic calculation that quickly devolved into inevitable heartbreak. This felt different. It was an interior quiet, a sense that a profound, secret work was being done without her permission or effort. She wanted to laugh at the thought. A barren woman declared incapable by city doctors, daring to entertain such a foolish, desperate hope again. But another part of her, the part Loren had awakened, whispered that perhaps the world had not finished surprising her. One cool, clear morning, as the sun began to paint the canyon walls red, she stood by the water trough while Loren mended a saddle. She twisted the edge of her shawl, the words difficult to find. "I think something has changed in me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Loren looked up, his brow furrowed with immediate concern. "Are you ill? Is the wound bothering you?" "No," she shook her head quickly. "Not sick, just different. My body feels strange, heavy. My heart, too. It's full of a fear I've never known. Not of death, but of losing something I don't even possess yet." Loren studied her face, his gaze searching, but utterly unreadable. His silence was not confusing now. It was a profound space for her words to land. He looked at the shape of her body, the soft, subtle rounding that his own quiet attention to her had already noted, though he never spoke of it. "You should speak to Nolly," he said finally, his voice deep and steady. "The old midwife who lives 2 valleys over. She knows the body's secrets better than any doctor. She understands the language of the earth." By noon, the decision was made. They rode out, leaving Sonny under the watchful eye of a neighboring Apache woman. The journey was long, the trail winding through stands of cottonwood that were beginning to show the first pale yellows of early autumn. Claire sat behind Loren, holding tight to his waist, her cheek resting against the coarse weave of his shirt. She felt the steady rise and fall of his breath, a rhythmic guarantee that anchored her mounting fear. The destination was a small, ancient hut, nestled in a hidden, lush fold of the mountains. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Nolly, the old midwife, sat cross-legged outside, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes sharp, bright, and amused. She greeted them with a gentle cackle. So, Nolly said in accented English, her voice raspy. The river woman comes to me. News rides on the wind, Loren. It told me a stranger came from the water and learned to walk again. She motioned for Claire to sit. Come, daughter of the East, let me listen to the soil beneath your skin. Claire obeyed, her heart thrumming a frantic rhythm. Nolly placed a thin, cool hand against Claire's abdomen. The touch was light, almost imperceptible. Yet the old woman's gaze became intensely focused, searching the depths of Claire's being. The silence that followed stretched out, thick and heavy with anticipation. Claire could hear nothing but the rush of blood in her own ears and the faint, dry sound of the wind moving through the tall grass. Then, Nolly smiled. It was a slow, beautiful unfurling that revealed teeth like polished stones. There, she said softly, lifting her hand. The earth stirs. A small seed grows. It is the beginning of the next world. Claire froze, her breath catching painfully in her throat. She looked wildly at Loren, then back at the calm, certain face of the old woman. You mean? Nolly nodded. Life, the kind that sings beneath the ribs. Loren's herbs have done their work, healer. The woman's blood runs clean again. The land has forgiven her, and her body remembers how to listen. Loren's large hand tightened around Claire's shoulder, a grip of absolute certainty. Are you certain? He asked Nolly, his voice unusually strained. As certain as the sunrise, the midwife affirmed. Your sorrow closed the door, daughter. Men of science speak as though the heart and body are strangers, but the two are one. When sorrow closes the heart, the body sleeps. You opened your heart again, and the body remembered. Claire's vision blurred. The cumulative weight of all the years she had spent believing she was fundamentally flawed, broken, incomplete, inadequate, suddenly lifted, leaving her feeling hollowed out and impossibly light. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, spilled down her cheeks. I don't deserve it, she whispered, the words carrying the full, bitter weight of her past. Nolly reached out, touching Claire's hand with a profound, knowing gentleness. No one earns the rain, child, she said. It simply falls. Your spirit needed time to root itself in new soil. On the ride home, Claire sat in a silent, suspended state. The trail was quiet save for the rhythmic clip-clop of the horse's hooves. She kept one hand pressed firmly against her belly, a gesture of fierce, protective ownership. Loren finally broke the silence as they neared the valley. You are still afraid? Yes, she admitted. What if it's a mistake? What if I lose it? What if the river decided this was only a temporary loan? He guided the reins with one hand, glancing back at her, his expression resolute. Then we will love what we have for as long as the earth allows. We will thank the spirits for the time given. The breathtaking simplicity of his faith undid her. She pressed her face against his back and cried, not from grief this time, but from the overwhelming, impossible tenderness of being absolutely and wholly believed in. When they reached the cabin, the sun was sinking, painting the valley in rose and gold. Sonny ran to meet them, barefoot and laughing. Claire knelt, gathering the child into her arms. Did Nolly make you better, Shitza? Sonny asked. Claire smiled through her tears. She said the land is growing something inside me. The girl's eyes widened in awe. A baby? Maybe, Claire said softly. Maybe the earth is lending me a miracle. Loren's laughter rumbled low and warm. The first time Claire had heard him laugh so fully, without any shadow of past loss behind it. She looked up and saw on his face something akin to religious awe, not for her, but for the mystery that bound them all to the cycle of life. That night, after Sonny had finally drifted off to sleep, Loren lit a single candle. He retrieved a small block of cedar and began to carve another figure. This one he shaped into a mother holding a child close to her heart, her face simple but radiating peace. He placed it carefully on the shelf beside the first carving. For our home, he said simply. Claire stood beside him, her fingers tracing the smooth, warm wood. You gave me back my life, Loren. He shook his head, looking down at the carving. No, you just needed someone to remind you it was still yours. Outside, the wind rose, brushing gently against the walls. Claire felt it move through her hair, across her face. The same wind that had once nearly drowned her, now carrying the impossible scent of promise. She looked out over the dark fields, the stars sharp and bright, scattered like seeds across the sky. Her hand rested on her belly, and for the first time in all her years, she didn't pray for mercy. She prayed only for gratitude. "Sleep, Claire," Loren's voice came, low and certain from behind her. "The earth is awake now." And as she closed her eyes, the wind answered him. A rustling sigh outside, the sound of the land breathing, alive again, and carrying life beneath its surface. The valley yielded to winter with a profound gentleness that year, as if the land itself were holding its breath, intent on nurturing the fragile peace that had taken root within the small cabin. Frost laced the tall, dormant grasses each morning, and the river, beneath a thin, crystalline skin of ice, ran clear and quiet, its tumultuous voice muted into a low, steady hush. Inside, the world contracted to the circumference of the firelight. The air, heavy with the layered scents of cedar smoke, dried sage, and the warm, earthy aroma of cornmeal, wrapped the rooms like a thick, insulating blanket. Claire moved slower now, her body round and monumental, her steps measured and deliberate. The exhaustion of the first fever had been replaced by the rich, demanding weight of creation. Loren became her constant, quiet anchor. He had built the cradle with an almost religious intensity during the autumn. Small, sturdy, its cedar wood sanded until it felt like warm silk beneath the touch. He had meticulously etched symbols along its sides, the spiraling horns of the mountain sheep for strength, the undulating waves of the river for continuity, and a single sweeping line of wind that wove through them all. "The wind," he had told her, his fingers tracing the carving, "is the messenger between the living and the land. When our child dreams, the wind will carry those dreams home." Claire often stood over the empty cradle, one hand resting protectively on the life that pulsed beneath her ribs, tracing Loren's carvings. She had sewn the lining herself from scraps of buffalo hide and worn cotton, a soft patchwork nest. Sunny, radiating pride, informed everyone who visited, mostly neighboring Apache women bringing food or herbs, that she would soon be a shitza to a new little warrior. Loren went into town only once. A long solitary ride to trade cured herbs for flour and necessary supplies. When he returned, dusted with snow and cold, he presented Claire with a small, unexpected gift, a silver hairpin shaped like a delicate feather. "Where did you find something so fine?" She laughed, touched by the unnecessary beauty of it. "In a store run by a man who overcharges and undersmiles," Loren said, deadpan. "I told him it was for a woman who had outlived the river. He gave me a fair price." She touched the feather gently. "You think I've outlived the river?" "You've learned its song," he replied, his eyes dark with certainty. "That's harder." Late in February, the first tentative whispers of pain arrived. They were low, rhythmic spasms that Claire initially mistook for the restless movements of the baby. They deepened, however, growing steady, like the slow, purposeful drumbeat of distant thunder. Loren was outside, meticulously splitting cedar logs, the sound of the axe echoing sharp and clean across the snow. "Loren," she called, her voice thin and suddenly small. He was at her side in moments. His axe dropped in the snow, his calmness immediate and absolute. He sent Sunny to fetch warm water and clean cloths, instructing her with a quiet dignity that kept the child focused, channeling her excitement into helpfulness. Then he knelt beside the cot, brushing the damp hair from Claire's forehead. "It is time," she gasped, gripping his hand, her fear momentarily overriding the pain. He nodded, his gaze steady, grounded. "Then the wind will help us." The hours that followed were a crucible of light and shadow, fire and water. Outside, a soft, persistent snow began to fall, tapping almost silently against the window panes. The fire hissed and cracked, throwing long, swaying shadows that danced across the adobe walls. Loren worked tirelessly, crushing pain-relieving herbs, whispering low, powerful prayers in Apache that Claire could not understand but felt deep in her bones. He placed warm, damp cloths on her back and abdomen, his rough hands infinitely gentle, an anchor in the storm of her body. Claire fought through the pain, feeling at times as though she might simply shatter, dissolved by the sheer force of life pushing through her. But through the haze of agony, she clung to two things: Loren's eyes, steady and grounded, a fixed point of immense strength, and Sonny's small, warm hand clutching hers, a promise of the future. Almost there. "Shitsa," Loren murmured again and again, his voice a low, constant rhythm that seemed to rise from the earth itself. When the final, agonizing cry tore through her, Claire thought she might faint from the shock of release. But then instantly came another cry, higher, smaller, utterly raw and bright as dawn. A baby's cry. Loren caught the child in his hands, his face breaking open with a mixture of immense relief and overwhelming wonder. The sound of the newborn filled the small cabin, wild and pure, like the first impossible call of spring. Sonny laughed aloud, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's a girl!" she shouted joyously. Loren looked down at the tiny, squirming, red-faced life in his arms, his own eyes wet with emotion. "Alive," he whispered. "She is perfect." He cleaned the baby swiftly, wrapped her in the soft blanket Claire had sewn, and laid her on Claire's chest. Claire stared in a daze, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. She's real," she murmured, unable to comprehend the simple physical truth of the warm, living weight on her body. "As real as the earth," Loren said, his voice thick with emotion. The baby's impossibly small fingers curled instantly around Claire's thumb. For a long suspended moment, no one spoke. There was only the crackle of the fire, the soft sigh of the wind outside, and the delicate, persistent breath of the newborn. When the pale light of dawn finally broke, the snow had ceased. Loren wrapped the baby securely, and after placing a kiss on Claire's forehead, carried his daughter to the open doorway. Claire watched from the bed, exhausted but full to the brim with a silent, overwhelming joy. He stood in the doorway, letting the cold, clean air touch them both. The valley lay silent, blanketed in fresh, untroubled snow. He lifted his face to the wind and, holding the child close against his chest, spoke low in the ancient Apache tongue. He introduced his daughter to the spirits of the mountains, the river, and the sun, dedicating her to the care of the land that had granted them life. When he returned, he knelt beside Claire and placed the baby gently back in her arms. "What will you name her?" Claire asked, her fingers tracing the baby's tiny features. "Aya," he said, his eyes gentle. "It means light of the morning." Claire smiled, a profound, resonant happiness filling her chest. "Aya Hartman," she started, referring to her maiden name, then shook her head, dismissing the bitter lineage of her past. "No, Aya Grey Wind," she corrected softly. "She should have the name of the messenger that brought me to you." Loren chuckled, the sound deep and warm. "Then so she shall." "The wind accepted her name," he said. "She belongs to the earth now, and to us. The small, beautiful life in her arms was the tangible proof that the river had carried her not toward an end, but toward a beginning, a final, absolute forgiveness from the land and from herself." Spring crept in slowly that year, not with a sudden, forceful burst, but with a cautious, gentle promise. The heavy snows melted, saturating the earth, and the Rio Pueblo swelled with new, clear water, singing a fresh, clean song as it tumbled over the stones. The world seemed to exhale after a long, intense holding of breath. Inside the cabin, the final, deep-seated tensions faded, replaced by the warm, steady, and demanding reality of a new family. Claire's strength returned swiftly, fueled by the impossible certainty of motherhood. She moved with a profound sense of purpose now. The days were a rich tapestry woven with simple, essential tasks. Feeding Iya Grey Wind, whose skin was the color of pale cedar and whose tiny hands gripped everything with surprising tenacity. Helping Sonny, now fiercely proud of her title of Big Sister, feed the small flock of chickens, and working beside Loren in the newly turned garden patch behind the cabin. Loren, meanwhile, finished the work of restoration. He patched the bullet-splintered cabin walls, singing softly as he worked, his voice low and melodic. His days were spent mending fences along the south meadow, his movements flowing with an unburdened ease that Claire had rarely seen before. He was the anchor, the quiet provider, his gaze often returning to the sight of Claire, sun-dappled and busy, with their daughter nestled in a sling against her chest. At night, The four of them, man, woman, child, and infant, gathered by the hearth. The glow painted their faces in deep gold and shadow. Claire would watch Loren cradle Iya, his hands, once rough from warrior's work and healing herbs, now impossibly gentle as they supported their tiny daughter. In those moments, she would feel a surge of happiness so complete it was terrifying, a raw vulnerability that momentarily seized her breath. One evening, as the fire settled into a bed of glowing embers, Claire voiced the lingering philosophical question that the miracle had raised. "Do you ever wonder why it happened?" she asked, her gaze on the dancing flames. "After all the years I believed I couldn't bear life. Why did the earth choose now?" Loren shook his head, looking at the sleeping form of Iya, whose small chest rose and fell evenly. "The earth doesn't owe us answers, Claire. Sometimes it simply gives what it chooses, when it chooses. If we search for a specific reason, we miss the gift itself," she smiled faintly. "You make it sound like grace." "It is," he said simply. "It is the moment when what you need meets what the world has to give." As the weeks passed, the land fully turned green. Wildflowers, small and intensely bright, climbed along the riverbank against the rust-colored soil. Claire walked there often, Iya nestled securely in her arms, Sunny skipping ahead, her laughter echoing clear and sweet between the cliffs. Sometimes, Claire would pause at the precise spot where the river had once left her broken and cold. She would kneel and let the water touch her fingertips. The current no longer whispered of finality or despair. It spoke instead of movement, continuation, and life that refuses to be stopped. She would offer a quiet, wordless thank you to the strong, relentless current that had carried her not to death, but directly into the heart of life. One late afternoon, as the sun began its descent behind the magnificent red cliffs, Loren joined her there. Iya slept against Claire's shoulder, tiny and peaceful. The setting light turned the water to liquid copper. Loren reached out and took Claire's free hand, his palm rough and familiar against hers. "Do you remember the very first thing I said to you, Claire?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, looking out at the shimmering water. "You said the river brought me here for a reason," he smiled, his eyes holding the light of the sinking sun. "And now you know what it was." Claire looked out over the valley, the wild, rugged place that had been transformed from a wilderness of sorrow into a home blooming with wildflowers and laughter. "I thought I was broken," she said quietly, the old words tasting strange and foreign on her tongue. "But maybe I was just waiting to be found, waiting for the wind to carry me to where I belonged." He squeezed her hand, a gesture of absolute shared understanding. The wind finds what the world throws away. They stood there as the evening deepened, the wind curling around them like a living thing, a comforting presence. Neither spoke again. The silence between them had already said everything that needed to be said. As the sun finally slipped behind the mountains, leaving a last brilliant blaze of light across the water, the three of them, Loren, Claire, and their daughter, stood at the edge of the world. In that glowing silence, they were exactly where they were always meant to be, not separate, not lost, but home. The prairie stretched endless around them, painted with the deep, settling colors of dusk. And when the wind rose again, soft and endless, it carried with it the mingled, beautiful sound of their lives, the quiet joy of a woman reborn, the deep contentment of a man redeemed, and the effortless, happy song of a child whose very existence had turned sorrow into the promise of tomorrow.